Yep, we've got you loud and clear, Kat, and go right
All
ahead.
right. Okay, let's dig right in. Let's start with background for the science of popular diets. So you maybe wonder who's dieting, right? So if you look at the current population in the United States, right now we're currently at around 329.2 million people in the United States. And you guys have probably seen these statistics. 2 out of 3 adults, or nearly 70%, are overweight or obese. So yes, that means that America is fatter than ever, and the obesity prevalence seems to be continually increasing among adults. So we're now at almost 4 out of 10 adults are being obese, and youth as well, with 1 out of 5 children nearly being obese. So what that means is that approximately 65 million people are on a diet at any given moment. And I'm sure you've come across all the different types of popular diets. There's so many choices, so much confusion out there. So hopefully we'll be able to provide you guys with some evidence around these popular diets, at least the ones that were outlined in the agenda. So I'll give you guys some guidelines. We'll talk about the claims, some of the claims around the proponents of each diet and how they purportedly work. Then we'll go over the pros and cons. We'll do a little bit of fact checking with some research. And then I'm going to close with what the best weight loss diet is. And then I'm going to give you some habits of successful losers, and that is successful weight losers. So that's what's on the agenda for my end today. And so let's get started right in with the paleo diet. It's got a lot of names. So it's also referred to as the Stone Age, hunter-gatherer, ancestral, primal, caveman, Neanderthal diet. So a lot of different names for it, but essentially what it is essentially consuming foods that only our ancestors during the Paleolithic period had access to. So that was about 2.5 million to 10,000 years ago, before there was farming, agriculture, and domesticating animals. So anything that you can hunt and gather, you could eat. So whether it's meats, insects, all parts of the animal, items you could gather from animals, fruits, veggies, obviously nuts and seeds you could gather. What you can eat on the paleo diet, what's prohibited, are those foods that are a byproduct of farming and agriculture. So milk, dairy foods, although some versions of the paleo allow grass-fed, and then all grain products. So that means no cereal, no bread, no pasta, no tortillas, no rice, no oats, any of that stuff, none of the legumes, and then anything that's in a package, right? So refined grains, processed foods, anything that's, snack food, as well as alcoholic beverages are prohibited on this diet. So proponents of the diets will claim that our ancestors didn't have, the chronic diseases that we see today: obesity, diabetes, heart disease, etc. And so if you eat like them, you won't have these, chronic diseases. And finally, they also say that, well, our biology isn't suited for certain foods, and therefore you should avoid them. So let's start with some fact checking. Anthropologists have discovered that the basic hunter-gatherer diets, they varied by where these individuals live. So take a look at the percentage of different foods in the diets denoted by the different colors, and according to where they lived in the world. And as you can see by the different colors and the proportions, it varied widely according to what they had access to in their environment. So essentially, the key takeaway here is there's no one singular paleo diet. It always depended on what you had access to, what you can hunt down, what you could survive on, just getting to the next day. That's the first fact check. Secondly, when it comes to chronic disease, it's really important to note that the lifespan was significantly shorter in the Paleolithic period. So they only lived about half of the lifespan, or even less than what it is today. Today's lifespan among women is 79 years, among men it's 78. So there wasn't a lot of time really to develop, chronic disease. And then if you look at some of the anthropologists, the evidence around what was gathered in mummies, you'll see that there's plaque buildup in these mummies who were eating a hunter and gatherer diet. So despite the shorter lifespan, you see some evidence of at least the start of chronic disease. In terms of fact checking whether or not our biology can handle certain foods, let's take a look at dairy first. So approximately 40% of the population has developed a genetic mutation over time to allow us to break down milk sugar. So lactase is the enzyme that breaks down lactose, the milk sugar, and people have developed the ability to keep that enzyme on due to the fact that there was an increased prevalence of dairy after the Stone Age. Also, something to keep note is that maldigesters, lactose maldigesters, they can still tolerate some dairy, and that's equatable to 12 grams or the amount of serving in the amount of lactose in one serving of dairy. Now, another thing that paleo proponents will say was that our ancestors did not eat grains. And so again, there's more evidence that not only were there hunter-gatherer tools that were used to grind up flour and oats and things like that, there's also evidence that, there's starch grains found in fossilized plaque of the Neanderthals. And so these were some studies, and I just put the references here for you guys to see. Okay, another claim that the paleo diet proponents makes is that grains cause inflammation. And so if you look at this, it's true. For about 1% of the population with celiac disease, right, they can't tolerate gluten in wheat and other products. And then another estimated 10% of the population have something called gluten sensitivity and have an adverse reaction. But it's possibly true for processed foods and refined grains and added sugars as well that can cause and increase markers of inflammation like C-reactive protein. But it's not true when you talk about whole grains like oats, like the things you see in this picture, which decrease inflammation and provide fiber for our gut and our microbiome. So another fact check is around legumes. And what paleo proponents say are that legumes were not consumed and contain anti-nutrients. Therefore, you should not eat them. And so archaeologists have discovered grain and legume residue, once again, in paleo fossilized human dental plaque. And then another fact is that anti-nutrients are often neutralized when you cook the food. And not only that, but it's only harmful in large quantities. So I'll give you an example. Phytic acid in whole grains, it helps to bind heavy metals like lead and cadmium in the gut, which is a good thing, right? And it's also been found to enhance immune cells. So that's a little bit of fact checking on the paleo diet, sort of the claims on why it works they don't really hold up. But let's take a look at some of the research around the paleo diet and what it says around, weight loss. So if you look at first short-term trials between 3 and 12 weeks, what you'll find as compared to the Mediterranean diet, you're going to see similar amounts of weight loss, but maybe better waist circumference and glucose sensitivity. You're also going to see better satiety, that is the feeling of fullness or satisfaction, regardless of the calories or macros. You'll also see improvements in blood pressure and improvements in blood lipids. On the other side of that, you'll also see, because you take away whole food groups like the all dairy products, that 50% of individuals ended up deficient in calcium compared to a regular diet. There are also reports of it being really difficult to stick to. And then no significant improvements of markers of inflammation were found in these short-term trials under 3 months. We did a little deeper on the longest paleo study that was conducted. This happened to be a 2-year study with 70 obese postmenopausal women with a mean age of 60. And they were randomized to either the paleo diet or something called the Nordic nutrition recommendation, which is similar to the dietary guidelines which we have here in the United States. And so what you find in terms of weight loss is that the paleo group, they lost more weight initially in the first 6 months, but after 2 years, it was similar rates and amounts of weight loss. So you'll see similar improvements in blood pressure, CRP, which stands for C-reactive protein, a marker of inflammation, and cholesterol, but no changes and no differences in insulin or fasting glucose. So that's a quick research look. I know there's a lot of more research we can look at, but in terms of time, I sort of am talking about at high level. When we talk about pros and cons of the paleo diet, well, obviously it's a benefit to eat more fresh whole foods and get more food variety, which a lot of Americans do not do. Eliminating processed foods with a lot of added sugars, fats, and sodiums, that would be definitely advantageous for many people to do. Cooking at home, right? Cooking at home, that's a good thing because the research shows that people tend to cook healthier and eat better when they prepare meals at home. And then probably the most important thing is that when you take away whole food groups like grains and dairy and legumes, you're going to cut calories. You're going to create a calorie deficit. And then the pro to that is you're going to lose weight. The cons of this diet are, well, micronutrient deficiencies. So if you're cutting out whole food groups like calcium, calcium-rich foods, well, you're going to be lacking in those micronutrients along with vitamin D. Same goes for cutting out grains and legumes. You're eliminating a large portion of your micronutrients, which of course are essential to human health and metabolism. You eliminate plant protein sources. It can be overly restricted for some people to follow this type of diet, and then switching from processed to whole foods, that can also increase food cost. So that's essentially the paleo from a high level perspective, right? What foods you can't have. Do you guys want to pause right now for any questions? This might be a good place.
We're ready pulling these up, but yeah, you can go ahead and just keep on going, Kat, and
Okay.
we'll kind of compile everything for a Q&A at the end.
Okay, great. All right, so ketogenic diet. Let's dig into keto because I know this is probably the hottest one right nowadays, along with the new carnivore diet, if you can believe it or not. So the ketogenic diet is a very low carbohydrate, high fat diet. I'm going to be discussing the modified ketogenic diet today with you guys. The classic ketogenic diets were much higher in fat, but the ones that's more common today are this modified ketogenic diet. So it's defined as having a diet with 50 grams per day or less of carbohydrate, which equates to about 5 to 10% of total calories. You can see here by the graphic how the food would be broken down in a typical ketogenic meal. Moderate amounts of protein, high in fat, and sometimes people will verify they're in ketosis by using something like a keto stick or something similar to measure the amount of ketones in the body, which I'll go over in a second. So the ketogenic diet has been around for a long time. Back in the 1800s, a low carbohydrate diet was used to treat diabetes. More commonly in the 1920s, it was used to treat epilepsy or seizures in kids, very successfully, by the way, successfully treated epilepsy. And then in the 1970s is really when things started to blow up with Dr. Atkins publishing and creating the Atkins diet. And then in 2007, Gary Taubes, he wrote a couple books on low carbohydrate diets, sort of touting a metabolic advantage of these types of diets. And then the ketogenic, which is more mainstream today. It's been a while for quite some time. If you look at the diet breakdown of a ketogenic meal, if you look at 1,600 calories, you can see very little carbohydrates, 20 grams, more fat than protein. And then for a 2,000 calorie diet, you get 5 more grams of carbs and then a lot more fat in comparison to your protein. So as you can see, it's moderate protein and high fat. So obviously what's going to be banned on this diet would be anything that's carbohydrate rich. Everything you see here on the screen, breads, pastas, cereals, starchy vegetables, fruit juices, beans, lentils, etc. Any kind of snack food would be banned as well, you know, your convenience foods, cookies, crackers, etc. Which leaves us with what's left, right? So what's left? Well, now you've got protein and fat. So foods that are high in saturated fat, like fish and bacon and butter, foods that are high in your healthier fats, like olive oil and avocado, nuts and seeds. And then, of course, you could have some dairy, certain fruits in small portions like berries, and then you can have non-starchy vegetables like leafy greens, asparagus, etc. So those would be your allowed foods on the ketogenic diet. Very restrictive. So what are the claims to this diet? So the claims are essentially that carbohydrates stimulate the release of a hormone called insulin, and insulin drives fat storage. Also that limiting carbs, if you don't eat carbs, well, you're not going to release insulin, and therefore you're going to force the body to burn fat, break down fat instead of carbohydrates. And when you break down fats like this, it produces ketone bodies in the blood. That's why it's called the ketogenic diet. So the claimants will say this results in a metabolic advantage. You're going to burn more calories. You're going to lose more weight if you're following this type of diet. So let's fact check real quick. Insulin alone is not the premise for fat storage. It does drive fat storage, but it only results in fat gain in the presence of excess calories. The primary function of insulin is to regulate blood sugar. And I have a graphic to show you in a second, but essentially it's to help you store energy and then release it for later on with a counter-regulatory hormone. So the body's always trying to maintain homeostasis, right? It's always trying to be in balance. So if you take a look at the bottom of this graphic, you can see a normal glucose level down here. And so what happens is you eat, and then on the left-hand side of the graphic, your blood glucose level increases and it results in hyperglycemia or too much glucose in the blood. Well, the body's going to try to fight to get back to homeostasis. So that's going to initiate the pancreas for the beta cells to then release insulin into the blood, and that's going to stimulate your cells to then, get the glucose transporters to mobilize and to remove the glucose from your blood and bring you back down to normal levels of glucose. So that's essentially what insulin does when you eat, every time you eat, especially carbohydrates, but protein as well. So then let's say 4 hours passes by and your blood glucose levels start to drop, right? You all have experienced symptoms of low blood sugar levels. And so then what the body does goes, okay, my blood sugar is dropping too much. I want to get back to balance. The pancreas then releases a counter-regulatory hormone. Insulin's partner is called glucagon. That will stimulate the liver to then break down your stored carbohydrates it stored earlier, or to create new carbohydrates from other substrates so that it can then raise your blood sugar levels back to normal. Okay, so it does this periodically throughout the day. Humans are periodic eaters, and so we're wired to store energy, release energy, store energy, release energy. So is there a metabolic advantage to eating a ketogenic diet? So Dr. Kevin Hall he does a lot of work in this area. He wanted to answer that question. And so in this metabolic ward study, he recruited 17 obese men comparing isocaloric diets and the effects that it had on body composition, on energy expenditure or total daily calorie burn, as well as fat oxidation. So the way this study was designed is it started with, okay, let's have you guys follow this high carbohydrate baseline diet, and then we're going to switch you to a lower carbohydrate diet. But we're going to match calories and we're going to match protein, so those aren't confounding variables. We just want to look at the effect of carbohydrates and obviously higher fat. They did a little bit of exercise, 90 minutes a day of stationary bike. All of the food was provided, so it was really tightly controlled with supervised meals, etc. So here was the basic breakdown of the diets. The BD stands for baseline diet, KD, ketogenic diet, and you can see started with high carbs, right? And then switched to really low carbohydrates underneath that 50-gram maximum per day of a ketogenic diet. And then, of course, the fat drastically increased on the ketogenic diet. So there's a sort of breakdown of the study design. You can see there's a little bit of period where they adjusted for energy intake, and then they followed this baseline data, and then 4 weeks on the carb diet. The gray bars denote when they were being monitored in a metabolic chamber. The little AA water DLW dose, that actually sophisticated way of measuring energy expenditure, and DEXA is how they assess. So the results were that during the first week of this ketogenic diet, you're going to see a drop in insulin. That's to be expected. Take away carbohydrates, drop in insulin. And as a result, because you're eating more fat, you are burning more fat. There was a small 100-calorie increase in energy expenditure, EE, during the first week of the ketogenic diet, but then that dropped down, that normalized. Okay, so it was just this transient effect that happened. There were similar rates of fat loss. So there was no significant difference, and that really makes sense because the calories and the protein were matched, right? They were consuming the same amount. So essentially what was concluded was that there was no metabolic advantage observed following this ketogenic diet. Now, some of you may think, well, it's not long enough. Maybe it needs to be long enough. And yes, there were longer studies that were conducted. So let's talk about some of the longer ones, although these, comparatively speaking, this is short term. I'll talk about the long term ones next. There's a ton of them. I picked a few and just sort of cut and paste so that you guys can see how many different studies there are on the ketogenic diet. But essentially, when you comb through the research, what you'll find is that the short-term studies that span between 4 and I think 10 weeks, is that what I have on here, 4 and 10 weeks? Yeah, it essentially results in spontaneous reduction of calories. So people are going to lose weight because they're spontaneously eating fewer calories on the ketogenic diet. Now, longer term, this was a meta-analysis of 28 control trials and comparing essentially low-carb diets and low-fat diets and the effect that they had on body composition and energy expenditure. And so if you look at, first of all, energy expenditure, 8 of the 28 trials in this meta-analysis found that the low carbohydrate diets led to higher energy expenditure than high carb, with 4 of these studies being statistically significant. 20 of the studies reported the high carbs led to greater energy expenditure. Did I say that right? I think I did. And 14 were statistically significant. And if you think about it, the thermic effect of feeding, that is the calories that you use to digest, process carbohydrates, is greater. It's around 8 to 10% of calories is greater than fat, where you only burn around 1% of the calories that you consume from fat to digest and process that. So that kind of makes sense. So if you look at the sort of totality of the evidence, right, this side favors the low-fat, high-carb diet. This side favors the low-carb diet. You can see that there's more favor tends to be in terms of energy expenditure towards the lower fat, high-carb diet. But it turned out to be the weighted mean 26 calorie per day greater with a lower fat, higher carbohydrate diet. Now, in terms of body composition, what did this meta-analysis find? So 20 studies evaluated body fat in these, among these trials, and 3 favored the low carbohydrate diet. So diets of equal calories from carbs and fats, what do they have? They had similar impacts on fat loss and energy expenditure. So the body of evidence suggests that the slight advantage is for higher carbohydrates. So again, if you look at the graphic here, you'll see that the favoring of the low fat, high carb on the left, and the favoring of the low carb, high fat diet on the right. And so the impact on body fat was basically, very small, 16 grams per day greater fat loss, 16 grams for the low fat diets. So what can we conclude? Well, ketogenic diets are very effective for weight loss, right? It also decreases insulin. You're going to see greater fat burning on the short term, but that magnitude will decrease with time. We've also seen in the research that it's equally effective as other calorie-restricting high carbohydrate diets on the long term. It appears to have appetite-suppressing effects independent of protein, and that you're going to eat less on a ketogenic diet. People spontaneously reduce their calorie intake. So in terms of metabolic advantage, we don't really see that in the evidence of there being a metabolic advantage. So the takeaway here is carbohydrates and insulin, independent of excess calories, do not cause weight gain. You have to have a calorie surplus. So it goes back to the, the law of thermodynamics applying once again. You could probably surmise that some of the pros around this ketogenic diet would be that people eat less, right? So in this 4-week study, you can see close to 300 calories, not dollars, consumed less on the ketogenic diet. It's pretty straightforward. People like to have really simple strategies when it comes to weight loss. They don't like them to be complicated, so cutting carbs seems really simple. And then this sort of increased satiety or appetite suppressing effect that the ketogenic diet has, that is also a pro. Not being hungry is really attractive to a lot of people. Then you gotta look at the cons. And you got to think to yourself, well, it's kind of restrictive. Like, can you really live the rest of your life without having birthday cake or mashed potatoes or whatever your favorite carbohydrate-rich food is? That could be really challenging in terms of adherence. And then having to eat a lot of fat is a very common complaint that I hear. The protein intake is suboptimal for most favorable body composition changes. And then low fiber is something you've got to consider too. Limiting fruits and vegetables, that impact on your micronutrient status and what impact that might have on your gut microbiome. And then long-term, we really don't know long-term when people stay on this diet for years and years and years, what that actually has on impact on especially blood lipids. that's ketogenic diet. Let's shift into the next one, which is intermittent fasting, another very popular method of weight loss nowadays, intermittent fasting. So the basic premise here is that you don't cut food groups, you just don't eat for a certain period of time, right? Followed by a time where you can just eat what you normally eat. So there are 3 types. It's very fascinating, the types of fasting that's out there: alternating, whole day, and time restricted eating. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper into each one of these. So it's really important to know when we talk about fasting that a lot of the research has been performed mostly in animals, right? So you see a lot of the headlines, oh, fasting is good for aging and longevity and extending lifespan. Well, a lot of that research is very, very, early, and it's mostly in animal studies. When you take a look at the alternate day fasting, it is the most well-studied type at this point in time. This is a big, popular growing area of research. So I'm sure that's going to change. But essentially what you'll see is an overall 25% reduction in calorie intake, which of course, if you cut calories, you're going to lose weight. In some of the studies you look at, they retain their lean body mass. In others with greater deficit, they don't retain their lean. So if you look at this particular study, which was done in obesity in 2016, it was the first study to compare fasting to normal calorie restriction, so maintaining a calorie deficit. And so you can see it's a pilot study. They took 26 obese adults. They randomized them to 0-calorie alternate day fast, followed by ad lib, which is essentially eat whatever you want, or to a group that maintained a 400-calorie day deficit. They provided all the foods. So it was an 8-week study. And what they found was that the alternate day fasting group, they reduced their calories. They created essentially almost a 400-calorie day deficit with no adverse effects. But there were no differences in weight or fat loss at the end of 2 months. So essentially, you got the same result, right? They both cut calories, lost similar amounts of weight. And then at 24 weeks, 6-month follow-up, there were no significant differences in terms of weight regain. For those of you may be wondering if people tend to overcompensate from the fasting, the research, at least in that study, didn't demonstrate that. Whole day fasting, the most popular type of whole day fasting is this 5-2 diet, where people follow this 5 days of regular diet, followed by, or interspersed, I should say, with 2 days of eating 400 to 500 calories per day. So what does the research say about that? It's super limited. I came across 7 short-term studies that were between 10 weeks and 6 months. They either had 1 or 2 days of a modified or complete fast with no food, 3 studies on overweight, 3 on normal weight. And essentially what happened, they all lost weight and all lost fat. In terms of lean body mass, it varied. They all showed improvements in blood lipids. And so anytime you have weight loss, regardless of the method, you're almost always going to see favorable changes in blood lipids. So you're going to find that in fasting as well. Time restricted eating, which is a form of fasting. I'm going to call it TRE because we like to use lots of acronyms. It's a daily window of time, right? So you have a certain period of time where you get to eat, followed by fasting, no eating. It typically spans between 12 and 20 hours of fasting. Again, this goes back to the animal research and what was shown in the animal research. And the premise surrounds following the body's circadian rhythms. So essentially, we have ideal body clocks, which we function optimally at. On the left-hand side is your healthy clock. And if you follow the circadian rhythms in terms of sleeping and eating, then you're going to have better mood, metabolism, cardiovascular health, and decreased risk of disease. And then the opposite is true for if you don't follow the normal circadian rhythms of the body, you have what's called a disrupted clock, and therefore you decrease sleep and you decrease overall quality of life and you increase your risk for disease. So if you look at the research on time-restricted eating, this particular study was on 16-8 time-restricted eating, so essentially you have 8 hours to eat versus a normal diet. What you'll see, you're probably going to be able to guess. This is an 8-week study, 34 young trained individuals, and they did RT, resistance training. And so what you're going to see is that they both lost weight. So similar amounts, nothing too different in between the two, similar increase in strength. But the time-restricted eating group lost significantly greater fat. You also see some changes in anabolic hormones in the time-restricted eating group only, testosterone and IGF-1, but we don't know what impact that has. I just observed reduced levels. This is a review of intermittent fasting and weight loss, and whether or not, taking a look at multiple studies and whether or not it's, effective for weight loss. And nearly all of your intermittent fasting studies will show that people lost weight. So in total, you'll see an on average a 20 to 25% reduction in calories, and then weight loss follows accordingly. So again, there's so many different types of fasting, but if you look at the totality of it, you'll see essentially it results in weight loss because they cut calories. What's interesting as well is that when you compare intermittent fasting to traditional dieting, which is just maintaining a daily calorie deficit, it's basically at 12 months, you're going to get similar results. So maybe for some people, that might be an alternative to try to maintain a calorie deficit every day, which some people find too difficult. It's important to note the dropout rate with alternate day fasting. In the research, there's a higher rate of dropout observed, as high as 40%. So you see higher drop rates just overall with any fat loss diet, but it seemed to be higher among alternate day fasting. Okay, so some of the pros and cons of fasting. So it's, again, equally effective as traditional dieting, calorie restriction. There's various, fasting protocols, limited research, no direct comparing sites. So we don't know which one is the best per se. Adherence is difficult, right? If you're not going to be eating for a full day or longer, that could be difficult. Your social life, if you go attend a lot of parties or any type of events involving food, that might be kind of, restrictive. But on the bright side, there's emerging research which demonstrates benefits for health biomarkers and the microbiome, but this is, again, emerging, so we don't quite know how that translates to human health yet. There are some people that want to avoid fasting. So if you've got diabetes or you're taking medication which requires food, definitely probably want to opt out of this one. If you have a history of eating disorders, or if you're a youth, you're still growing, probably not ideal for you. And of course, if you're pregnant or you're breastfeeding, not ideal, especially for breastfeeding when hunger and appetite tend to be at their own. You want to avoid this. Okay, last one. Let's do if it fits your macros, IIFYM, another acronym, right? If it fits your macros. So where does this come from? Essentially, it's grounded in dietetics. So this is what I learned when I went through a dietetics curriculum and energy balance. And essentially what you do is you calculate each individual needs. I'll go through that in a second. How did it get popular? Well, I found out that in online forums, people were asking other RDs, other people in fitness, nutrition professionals, whether or not they could eat certain foods. And so the standard response became, well, if it fits your macros, right? If you're eating overall a healthy diet, then you have a little bit of, wiggle room to eat, a favorite treat or something, it would be fine. It's overall okay to do that. So steps to if it fits your macros, essentially you would calculate what your resting metabolic rate is. We use prediction equations in dietetics, whether that's Harris-Benedict, Mifflin-St. Jean, other prediction equations to determine RMR. You can also do it in the lab, as you saw in some of the research studies where they actually measure RMR. But we typically calculate it using a prediction equation. And then we take your RMR and we figure out what your activity level is. And essentially, activity level will range from 1.1 up to 2.0 if you're very active. We combine those two and we come up with your total calorie expenditure, your total EE. Okay, we would then calculate, okay, what do you need for protein? Typically for weight loss, it's between 0.7 to 1.0 gram per pound of body weight per day. And then you could distribute your carbs and fats based on what you prefer. If you know that a gram of fat has 9 calories and then a gram of protein and carbohydrate has 4, you can quickly do the math and figure out, okay, I want to eat X amount of carbohydrates. I tend to love carbohydrates, and I'll cut my fat down. Or if you like higher fat, you could choose to eat that way, and you could still, consume the appropriate number of calories for your goal. All right, so some of the pros to if it fits your macros, right? So there's essentially the best pro about it is there's no food or beverage that's off limits. You could eat anything essentially. So it's very flexible. And the other part that dietitians love about it is it helps to build that awareness of calories in foods, what typical foods contribute to a large amount of calories or fat or protein, et cetera. So it really builds a good working knowledge in terms of nutrition and calories and what fits the individual's calorie budget, if you will. The thing that we like about it is that it can be highly tailored. So as long as we're meeting your protein and your calorie needs, we can sort of tweak the other areas based on whether or not you're a high level athlete or whether or not you prefer a lot of fat, things like that. So it's super flexible and it's highly, highly tailored. But as you can imagine, the cons would be that it requires ongoing tracking. So you're essentially calculating grams of protein, carbs, fats on a daily basis, right? So each food, how many grams of each one of those foods have to each macronutrient, and keeping track of that. That also means weighing and measuring foods. That can be a bit cumbersome, especially if you're going out to eat, like at restaurants. That might make it challenging, right? It might, make you look a little bit odd. Maybe some of you have carried around your scale before to a restaurant. So that can be challenging. In some cases, we've seen that it leads to people justifying consuming a lot of junk food or alcohol, for that matter, if it fits my macros, right? And so it's sort of this, twisted way of utilizing it. And it can lead to obsessive tendencies. In some people, it causes anxiety and even stress. And food should not cause stress, in my opinion. All right, so that's if it fits your macros. So let's dig into some of the concluding things. What's the common denominator to all diets? And this is a fellow dietitian. She created this graphic. I can't take credit for it. But if you were to sort of, put different popular diets and weight loss methods into these 4 categories, the top in blue would be the diets that restrict your food choices, right? You can't eat certain foods. Well, if you're restricting foods, what are you doing? You're cutting calories. Let's go to the bottom. Counting macros, meal plans, and Weight Watchers. What are you doing there? Well, you're controlling portions. And by controlling portions, what are you doing? You're cutting calories. If you look at intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating, what's the strategy there? Well, you're restricting the time. You're cutting the time that you can actually consume food. So in this case, what are you doing? You're cutting calories. And the same can be said about something called intuitive eating, where the focus is on tuning into your cravings and trying to curb overeating and binge eating. And so what are you doing in that case? You are also cutting calories. So the common denominator to every single of these diets, why they result in weight loss, is it cuts out calories. And when you cut calories, what do you force the body to do? Well, you force the body to use its own calorie stores, and so you lose weight. Okay, so the diet cycle goes like this. People start one of these diets. We call them fad diets or popular diets. They restrict something. They end up feeling deprived. They end up craving. They give into those cravings, and then they feel guilty, and they look like this person on the screen, right? And so what you need to know about popular diets, essentially what we found with popular diets or fad diets, is there's about a 95% failure rate when it comes to fad dieting or popular diets. So it's for that 5% of people who can follow keto or can do intermittent fasting, it might work for them. But if you look at it as a whole, popular diets or fad diets tend to not be successful. So what is the best weight loss diet, right? I promise you guys I give you the best weight loss diet. Well, the best weight loss diet consists of 2 things. And so the first one is, it's the one that puts you in a calorie deficit. And then secondly, what makes the diet the best for weight loss is you got to be able to stick to it, right? You have to be able to adhere to that dietary pattern or that lifestyle for the long haul, right? Because what are the key factors for succeeding? And it's adherence. And so when I talked about adherence, I'm like, okay, this makes perfect sense, right? Simba, essentially. Adherence is king. And if you look at the research around adherence to diets, this is a study done on measuring adherence to popular diets, Atkins being like a low-carb diet, Zone same, Weight Watchers portion control, Ornish being high-carb, low-fat. Take a look at the line and the adherence over time. It's really high at the beginning, right? People start off super motivated, and then over at time, their adherence drops over the course of a year. And it's essentially, there's no significant differences. So whether or not you can stick to something is king, and that makes sense, right? Anything temporary, if you adhere to a temporary strategy, you're going to get temporary results. And this is what happens to most people trying to adopt short-term strategies. They get short-term results. So you may be wondering, okay, popular diets, are they healthy? Is there a difference between, weight loss diets for health versus weight loss diets that aren't healthy? And the answer is essentially yes. So in this particular study in the Journal of International Science Sports Nutrition, they took 4 of these popular diets and they essentially analyzed the menus around these diets. So they wanted to know, do they provide 27 of the essential vitamins and minerals that our bodies require for human health and metabolism? And when they analyzed these diets, they found this. All of them failed to provide the daily requirements for all 27 essential nutrients. The diets provided sufficient amounts for 12 on average, and just FYI, you need about 30 different essential vitamins and minerals for human health and metabolism. And if you were to extrapolate the data to try to meet all of your daily requirements for all 27 essential nutrients, you would essentially have to eat almost 28,000 calories a day to get all those micronutrients. And so what's the downside of not getting enough of these essential nutrients? Well, you put yourself at higher risk of chronic disease, obesity, heart disease, cancer, osteoporosis. You guys all know someone who has osteoporosis. What was their main issue? Lack of calcium, vitamin D, bone building nutrients, and weight bearing exercise. So not getting enough essential nutrients puts you at risk for long-term chronic disease. And so the conclusion of this particular study, I highlighted it because I thought it was pretty funny. If you look at the highlighted portion, based on the study's findings, the belief that a healthy, balanced diet can consistently deliver to a typical dieter all of the essential vitamin and mineral that they need through whole food alone is in dire need of revision. So if you're a fitness professional, this speaks to you. Anytime your clients are cutting calories, they think they can get all the essential vitamins and minerals from food, the data points to the opposite. And it's not just this study, it's multiple studies have found similar results. And so in this case, getting a daily multivitamin and mineral is what dietitians recommend, is what fitness professionals can recommend to fill those micronutrient gaps, particularly during weight loss. So I put together this sort of summary slide for you guys. Looking at popular diets, I included, we didn't talk about vegan just for time purposes or gluten-free, but what it is, essentially, it summarizes the diet in terms of macronutrients or what foods are not allowed in that particular diet. And then you'll see some of the missing nutrients according to their diet. You can see for intermittent fasting and for if it fits your macros, which doesn't restrict anything. We looked at the data for commonly under-consumed nutrients in the United States. There's essentially 12 of them that most people don't get enough, and I listed them here. And some of the recommended supplements that you could help fill the gaps according to the popular diet that this individual or any individual would want to. Okay, I think this is essentially the last point, or second to the last point I'm going to make, and that is that protein sort of has this special place in regards to weight loss and body composition, changing body composition. Protein is special because, one, it helps to increase your feeling of fullness. It helps to manage hunger levels, which can be a challenge to some. It also helps to preserve and build muscle tissue even in a calorie deficit. So people who consume more protein preserve more lean mass. And of course, add resistance training to that, and you could even add some lean mass while in a deficit. It also helps to offset that adaptive thermogenesis reduction. So essentially, when you lose weight, what does your body do? It tries to survive, right? So it tries to adapt by lowering your metabolic rate. And so protein, because it takes so much more calories to digest and absorb it, 20 to 30% as opposed to lower amounts for carbs and fats, it can help offset that to a certain extent. And then I put the range of what would be recommended for protein, 0.7 to 1.5 gram per pound of body weight, with the higher end being for trained people that are trying to diet down in preparation for a show or a contest or or some type of competition. So once you meet your protein and calorie needs, essentially your carbs and fats can be based on needs and preferences and lifestyle. And you can probably get people to stick to what fits their needs and preferences probably a lot better than trying to get them to follow a short-term strategy. So what do successful weight losers actually do? So if you look at the habits of successful weight losers, what are the things that they're doing to keep the weight loss off? And this data comes from Rena Wing, obesity researcher that is in charge of the National Weight Control Registry. You can Google it. Fascinating data. It's a database of 10,000 adults who've lost an average of 66 pounds and kept it off for 5.5 years, right? That's obviously an exception to the norm that we see out there. But here's what they're doing. Their weight loss is ranging from 30 to 300 pounds. So you see significant amounts of weight loss. 98% are modifying their food intake, right? So in some cases, I would say in most cases, you got to change what you're eating. 94% increase their physical activity. On average, people exercise an hour a day, right? Because if you're losing weight, your metabolic rate's going to drop. Well, how do you offset that? You exercise, with the most common form of exercise being walking. 78% eat breakfast daily. That's not to say breakfast is necessary, but if you observe these habits of successful losers, 78% do consume breakfast. Self-monitoring is very important when it comes to successfully keeping weight off. That is weighing yourself once a week, as well as tracking and limiting sedentary activity, which is watching TV less than 10 hours per week. And then if you look at how they eat, most report consuming a low-calorie, low-fat diet. So that's what successful weight losers do. If you want to take some of that and apply it with some of your clients to see what actually works for long-term weight loss. So in closing, don't believe the hype. A lot of these diets will propose to be the best diet out there. And really, you know, the whole one-size-fits-all approach is not a good approach. So just because something works for you or works for one of your clients doesn't mean it's going to work for the next client. So keep that in mind. Keep in mind how diets tend to be effective overall, and really try to tailor your approaches according to that individual and what they prefer and what they can actually stick to. Okay, that's it. I made it, you guys, with 10 minutes to spare. So we have lots of questions. I hope we do at least. And if we do, then let's fire away.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Kat. That was an amazing presentation there. So we do have some questions lined up for you here.
Okay. So hopefully I can answer them.
First one is going to be, are dairy products necessary for a healthy diet, especially with so many dairy substitutes now available?
Dairy products per se are not necessary for health. What is necessary for health are the essential nutrients that are in the dairy products. But if you can get calcium and magnesium and vitamin D from other sources, that's fine. But it's interesting to note that the government fortified dairy milk with vitamin D, right? Because what's vitamin D? Vitamin D is the sunshine vitamin. You get it from the sun. You're right, the sun. UVB radiation converts your cholesterol in your skin into vitamin D, and then it affects about 1,000 metabolic processes. So I have a point, I promise. So the reason why the government added it to milk was because kids were coming up with rickets, soft bones. They weren't getting enough vitamin D because people used to work outside. Well, we switched from an agricultural society to an industrial society. We weren't getting enough sunshine, and then kids were having this vitamin D deficiency. So the government put it into the food supply so that that wouldn't happen, and we wouldn't have widespread diseases. So long story short is you don't need it if you can get vitamin D or some of these other nutrients from other sources, but it is a good source.
All right, thank you.
Brian, yeah, thank you, Kat. Yeah, we got another one here for you, Kat. How important is fiber intake on the keto diet?
Well, you know, there's essentially no fiber in the ketogenic diet. If you look at fiber in human health, fiber-rich diets have a positive impact on overall human health. If you look at the dietary recommendations for fiber, for women, you need 25 grams a day. Men, you need 38 grams a day to optimize health. Average human daily intake in our country is 14 grams a day. For the ketogenic diet, it's lower. And what do we know about the microbiome? Because the microbiome and gut health is a super hot topic right away. The best thing for the diversity of your good bacteria in your microbiome is a lot of different types of fiber. The more, the better. So we don't really know the long-term impact of not getting enough fiber and specifically the ketogenic diet, but we know that good fiber is good for you. I'd have to sort of dig deeper into the research to see if anyone's actually tested, the microbiome and the effects of the ketogenic on the microbiome. I doubt it, but I'd have to look.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And then for our final question here, is there a per day to be in what the student's asking for here is macro balance? So they're asking, can I have a day or two that's high in one area and a day or two that might be low, as long as I make it up during the week?
Are we asking about cheat days? Is that what this is?
I think so, yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Essentially, if you're maintaining your weight, right? If your goal is weight maintenance and you're up one day on carbs one day and then lower on the other, and you're maintaining your weight from maintaining a health standpoint, possibly. Do we know if you're getting all the essential nutrients your body needs on a daily basis? That's the X factor. Your body requires these 30 some odd vitamins and minerals on a daily basis, and you require it in certain amounts. We store some of them, we don't store others. So I think from a micronutrient standpoint, you might have some gaps here and there, not getting ideal amounts, right? And that's where, as a dietitian, I would say, taking a high quality multivitamin mineral is a good insurance policy for varied diets.
All right, thank you. So I do believe that's our last question that came in from the moderator here. So what we're going to do now is get one final slide up here.
Okay.
And this is for everyone in attendance here today. So if you've joined us in the past, there is one thing that we always do at the end of these webinars, and that is a free giveaway. So today we have a $100 DotFit gift card that we're going to be giving out to one participant. And we'll be getting those results in here in just a moment. All right, so today our winner is going to be Thomas Wilson.
Congratulations, Thomas.
So Thomas,
congrats.
we will make that connection here so that we can get you that gift for joining us today. One other thing too, we have a webinar special that we're running here. So I've got a phone number for you. That number is 888-773-1827. So I'll repeat that again. That's going to be 888-773-1827. You call that number in, mention the code webinar12. This is our 12th in the series so far here, and you'll be able to buy the new NASM nutrition certification for only $699.
And just to interject, Kat was one of the authors for
yes,
the nutrition certification. So we had 20 different authors. Obviously, they are all experts in their fields, and Kat was instrumental in helping with the nutrition certification. So the latest and greatest and experts in the field of nutrition, Kat was one of them. So thank you, Kat, for your...
Yeah, and a real amazing point on that too is that we noticed this during the presentation, Brian and I here, that even though the content Kat was presenting today was not specifically developed for our nutrition product, it's not even the chapter she helped me work on. It lined up with everything that's in that course.
Exactly.
Which is a real big thing when you're looking for nutrition info out there to give to your clients, to give to the people you're working with. You want the stuff that is supported by research. And, that's really the main point of why we developed the nutrition certification to begin with. So yeah, Brian, do you have anything else to give the group today?
Thank you, Kat, so much for joining us today. I hope we do this again.
Yes.
Your presentation was wonderful. Everyone else, thank you for joining us today. Again, the promo code is webinar12. It's the number 12. So webinar12. And call 888-773-1827 if you want to enroll in the nutrition certification. And then again, Thomas Wilson, congratulations on the $100 DotFit gift card.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, Kat, and everyone have a fantastic day.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.